Sometimes it is important to speak strongly and assertively in order to achieve what may seem unachievable. We'll see that from the way Rashi explains Yehuda's approach to Yosef. Right at the beginning of the parasha. Betchilas, parasha Sein Pirish Rashi, at the beginning of our parasha, Rashi explains Vayigash elov, that Yehuda approaches Yosef, who to his mind is the most powerful man in Egypt, not his brother Yosef, and he says, Daber be'oznei Adoni, let me speak into your ears. Says Rashi, what does it mean, speak into your ears? May my words penetrate your ears. So what's unclear in the statement that Rashi has to explain? So what seems to be unclear about Yehuda's statement, let me speak into your ear, that Rashi has to then explain. What he means is, I want my words to have an impact. I want them to enter your mind. The Mepharshim say that that if you had to read this pasuk at face value, it would sound like what he's saying is that he really wanted to go up and speak into Yosef's ear, which means speaking to Yosef alone to the exclusion of everybody else who is around him. Literally, like he's going to cup his hands and whisper into his ear that nobody else around him should be able to hear him. Now, that would never work in this context. You can't say that in the context of the king on his throne or the viceroy on his throne. It's completely undignified to go up to the viceroy of Egypt and say, I want to tell you a secret in your ear. Besides the fact that the security surely would never have allowed that. So that's how you would have misinterpreted the pasuk. Say the Mepharshim. That's why Rashi has to say, no, actually when Yehuda says, I want my words to enter your ears, it means something else. Not that I'm going to speak to you privately, but rather that I want to speak compellingly. Now, if that is true, the big question is, this is not the first time in the Chumash, it's not even the second time in the Chumash that we've heard about people speaking into somebody's ears. Rashi never felt that he had to address it before. Why now? And it's not a good enough explanation, because prior to this story, there are numerous times where we've heard about people speaking into people's ears. Rashi doesn't raise an eyebrow. One is Avimelech, after he wakes up, having gotten the message from the Eibishter that he dare not touch Sarah and that everybody's going to suffer if they don't let her free, he goes to tell in the ears of his courtiers. Or at the time of the sale of Maras Machpelah, we see that the Ephron goes to speak in the ears of the sons of Ches. Or Avram Avinu speaks to Ephron in the ears of the locals. Not one of those would make sense that it's whispering. What do you think? Avimelech played broken telephone with all the people in his court. Or Avram Avinu told a secret in the ears of the Amoritz. It doesn't make sense. There's no question Avimelech was not speaking directly into the ears of his people. And Ephron's announcement was an announcement, very much not quietly into the ears of Bnei Ches. Actually, he was primarily speaking to Avram Avinu in a way that the Bnei Ches should overhear it, the exact opposite of speaking directly into somebody's ear quietly. And he spoke in such a way that they also heard what he had to say to Avram Avinu. And likewise, when Avram Avinu is speaking to Ephron, he deliberately wants the people around to hear. So none of those could be speaking literally into somebody's ear, and yet Rashi does not seem to need to explain this. That what he's saying is, I want you to really take cognizance of what I'm trying to tell you, as he does here. So how come in all of those scenarios where it's obvious that you're not speaking secretly, Rashi's fine with it, but this one bothers him? Why is here the case where Rashi says we've got to explain this? Another clear question over here is, Rashi always only uses in the heading of his Rashi the words from the pasuk that he intends to explain. So if that's the case, why does he also include the words that Yehuda approached Yosef? That's not what he's explaining. Rashi's words, Yehuda saying, let my statement penetrate your ears, that is only an explanation of the words, Daber be'oznei Adoni, or Daber no be'oznei, not Vayigash elav. We've dealt with this before. Rashi's not trying to just illustrate what the name of the parasha is. We've dealt with this before. Because then Rashi would have done that across the board. Every parasha, he would have given us the first words. Rashi does not do that. He only includes words, even if they are the first words of the parasha, when he intends to explain them. What is the explanation in the context of Vayigash Elov? Now, before we can answer that, let's look at what Rashi says next. Then Rashi goes further and he takes the next statement that Yehuda makes, which is Ve'al yicharapcha. Don't get upset at me, don't be angry. Says Rashi, Mi kan. From here we realize that Yehuda spoke harshly to Yosef, and that's why he has to say, please don't be upset at me. So the Mefarshim explain, what do you mean? What's Rashi telling us over here? He's telling us that we're about to discover in Rashi's own words the harsh things that Yehuda had to say. In the next pasuk, Rashi is going to explain when he says, and Adoni Shoal. So there he's going to say, that part of what Yehuda had to say was some really harsh stuff. When Rashi quotes the words where Yehuda says, you are like Paroi, maybe Rashi after Rashi says the pshat, which is, I respect you like the king, then he brings various other explanations from the Midrashim, which were, you're going to suffer like your forefather, like Paroi suffered when Sarah was taken captive, or that you don't keep your word, like Paroi, which is a pretty harsh thing to say, or that I'm going to finish you off, start with you and end with Paroi. All very harsh statements. And then the next part, where Rashi quotes the words, Yehuda saying to Yosef, my master, you, Yosef, you asked me about a brother. I don't think the next thing we're going to abduct him. Again, it's a harsh expression, it's an accusation. You created a libel against us. So therefore Rashi explains that you should not think those words, and Adoni Shoal, those are the words that tell us that Yehuda is speaking harshly. Because the truth is, at face value, they don't seem to be harsh expressions. The pshat of those expressions is actually quite respectful. And Rashi is emphasizing it's from here, al yichar abcha. Now we know that Yehuda intended to speak harshly. Because of dvarim kashim, and because we don't see anything outwardly in the pasuk that was harsh in the words Yehuda is using. Well, then Rashi is going to explain to us what the harsh language is, even though he has to resort to a medrash, which is not his primary focus. His primary focus is pshat, but he's going to resort to a medrash because he's already illustrated to us that Yehuda is speaking harshly. Now, our question is, still, why does Rashi have to say mikan from here, which is an exclusive expression, meaning to say you think you get the information from elsewhere, but it's specifically from here. Rashi could have said this in an easier, simpler way to say, look, this teaches us that Yehuda spoke harshly. He doesn't have to say, Mikan, this is the source that Yehuda spoke harshly. Then it would have made sense. We still would have understood that when Yehuda is making the disclaimer, please don't be angry with me, that's because he's going to be using harsh language. And had Rashi used the word melamed, that would have given us a heads up that this is not something you're going to see clearly spelled out in the words of the pasuk, but it's something we can derive out of the context. Because again, had the words in the pasuk been outright harsh expressions, which they're not, we wouldn't have had to say melamed. So had Rashi said melamed, we'd know everything that Rashi wants to tell us, which is you have to look at a medrash to understand how to contextualize this pasuk, to see that Yehuda is actually speaking harshly, so you can appreciate why he's apologizing and saying, please don't be angry with me. But Rashi doesn't do that. He uses a very specific word, mikan. The Rebbe has already illustrated to us previously. Whenever Rashi says, this is where we learn something from, Rashi is showing us specifically, this is the source, not another place that you might have believed to be the source. Because perhaps there's somewhere else that you would have imagined teaches us this principle, and Rashi says, no, that's not the source, mikan, this is the source. So, must be what Rashi's doing over here, that he knows there's somewhere else that may have lent itself to making us think that Yehuda used harsh language, and Rashi wants to say, no, it's not from there, it's mikan. Even though, as we've illustrated, it's not clear in the pasuk, but this is where we know that he's speaking harshly to Yosef. And our question is, what was Rashi excluding by specifying this is from where you learn that he spoke harshly? So the first thing we're going to explain is that, to be honest, there's a significant difference between the earlier examples where it said speaking in the ears of people and this example. With Avimelech or Ephron, the Bnei Ches, when it said speaking into their ears, before you get to our pasuk, all of those scenarios are an individual speaking to a group. If you're speaking to a group, there's no assumption that you're speaking privately in one person's ear, and so therefore our assumption is that Oznei Ha'am is just a turn of phrase to say they all heard what he had to say. Okay, going. For example, the conversations back and forth between Avram and Ephron. That is a record of a conversation and negotiation between two individuals, Ephron and Avram. So the Torah is telling us, yes, that was a conversation between two individuals negotiating over Maras HaMachpelah, and at the same time there was a crowd around them who heard what they were talking about. That's what the Torah is basically drawing our attention to. And by the way, not only is the Torah telling us that they overheard a conversation they shouldn't have been privy to, but rather it's telling us that was the plan. That Avram and Ephron wanted them to hear what was going on, so they would know that the Maris HaMachpelah now belongs to Avram Avinu. No big surprises there. Rashi doesn't have to address it. Likewise, when it says that Avimelech spoke in the ears of the people of his court, there it's emphasizing that Avimelech personally addressed all of his servants. And there the Torah wants us to know that everybody heard from Avimelech that message. And why do we see that that's the case? We see because they all become very afraid. That tells you they heard it. They heard the message firsthand from Avimelech. So Rashi doesn't have to explain why it says Bosneim, because it is relevant to the context that Avimelech is speaking in such a way that it really gets through to them. Our pasuk is different. Now we're saying that Yehuda is approaching Yosef and says, I want to speak in your ears. Mr. Erez Kushya, that raises a question. Surely, the message here is a personal message to Yosef. And obviously, if it's a personal message to Yosef, then Yosef heard what Yehuda had to say. So what's the pasuk telling us? That the word should go into Yosef's ears. Well, surely that's obvious. It's not like the other scenarios where Avram and Ephron are speaking, and it's also important to know that it gets heard by other people. Or Avimelech is giving a message, and it's important to know that everybody gets his message. Here it's one-on-one. It's Yehuda to Yosef. Why do we have to know that it goes in his ears? So therefore, therefore Rashi has to tell us, first of all, you need to know Vayigash Elov. You need to know the context. Yehuda is approaching Yosef, which only makes it more of a reason to ask, so if he approaches him, why do you have to say that? I want you to hear in your ears what I have to say. Let's imagine the Torah had not told us that Yehuda approached Yosef. Then we could have at least given a bit of a stretch of an answer. That maybe Yehuda spoke in such a way that the others around him heard what he had to say. And that's why you had to specify, listen, everybody else is hearing, but you're the person who needs to listen to what I've got to say. Meaning specifically Yosef should listen to what he has to say. Even though he's addressing a crowd. Okay, that would have made sense. That would have been a Oznecha in this case. That fits all the other Oznaim that we've learned about before. Speaking to a crowd. But now the Torah tells me that Yehuda has come close to Yosef. Which means Yehuda and the brothers are already standing there speaking to Yosef, petitioning Yosef. The Torah has already contextualized that. Now Yehuda steps forward even closer to Yosef. Obviously, Yehuda is speaking specifically and exclusively to Yosef. And maybe it's even possible that only Yosef can hear him because he's that close. So if that's the case, we're back to square one. What does the Torah have to then say? Let my words enter your ears. But you've already made the physical approach of coming closer to Yosef, so he'll hear you. Why do you have to now say, and hear me? Therefore Rashi explains it's not about hearing. That the word your ears has another layer of meaning. That my word should penetrate your ears. That it should actually be absorbed internally. More like the Friedrich Rebbe said, it's not good enough just to listen, but you have to absorb the message. And that's what Yehuda is saying. I want you to absorb my message. Hear me out. Because the goal of Yehuda's presentation is to get Yosef to change his very clear decision, and that he should rather release Binyamin. And therefore he says, please, I don't want you to just hear what I have to say, I want you to hear me out, to absorb my message. Once we know that, now that Rashi has set the stage for us, that Yehuda is effectively petitioning Yosef, please listen closely. That's when he says, Rashi tells us, that when the Torah tells us, and Yehuda says, don't be angry with me, that tells us at this point that he's obviously speaking harshly. Had we not known this information, that he is approaching Yosef and specifying, I want you to hear deeply what I have to say, then we would have had another reason to come to the conclusion that that Yehuda had spoken harshly to Yosef, because he used the expression dibur, and we all know that in many places in the Torah we distinguish between amira and dibur, that amira is when you speak gently, and dibur is when you speak harshly. So you'd think that yedaber no avdecha davar, that expression is what tells us he's speaking harshly. Because Rashi has already introduced us to what he understands as a fundamental principle of simple understanding of the pasuk, which Rashi quotes extensively. That any time that the expression is dibur, not amira, it's a harsh expression. Rashi. Here Rashi is saying, that's not how I know that in this case, Yehuda is speaking harshly. Rather, he's drawing our attention to a different proof that he's speaking harshly. Specifically because Yehuda says, don't be angry with me. That's how we know. That he was speaking harshly, not from the generic term dibur, which is a harsh expression. Come on, how do I know he's speaking harshly? Mikan, because I already know that he's saying, I need you to hear what I have to say. In other words, let's understand this. What is it about the word dibur that always illustrates that you're speaking harshly? The simplest explanation of why dibur is a harsher expression, because the expression dibur, although it could mean speaking, could also mean to take control, to rule over nations. Dabar echad lador, a single ruler for a generation. And that ruler has the authority of toil makav hachal kol kodam, that you can literally hit people into submission. Which means the word dibur, or at least the root of dibur, is associated with authoritarian rule. So therefore, if the Torah should describe communication with the construct dibur instead of amira, that implies strength and leadership and rulership. That means that you're speaking with harshness because you have authority, and even more than authority, you have the capacity to be able to control somebody else. So therefore, if we understand that what dibur means is to compel somebody, there are various ways that you can compel somebody. It is possible to compel somebody to do something by speaking gently, by speaking in a way of petition. Meaning, you could have somebody who's speaking from what seems a very vulnerable position, begging for clemency, and he's actually doing dibur because maybe that's going to strike a chord in Yosef's heart, and that's going to get him to let Binyamin go. Therefore, in this context, the fact that we're using dibur does not mean he's using harsh language, because mean he's using very emotive language, which would also influence Yosef's decision. It is possible that the language Yosef is using is very emotive language, and that's what's going to get Yosef to change his that's the language Yehuda is using is going to get Yosef to change his stance. So maybe he's speaking softly and beseeching. Seeing as his goal is to change Yosef's mind, could be that soft language is also Yedaber. Whereas Rashi is saying, Mikan, it's only now that I know that he comes close to Yosef and says, I need you to hear what I have to say. That's how we know he's speaking cautious. How do I know that he's speaking harsh expressions? Because he's saying, please don't be angry with what I'm about to say. That's what Rashi emphasizes. This is the source to teach us. That has a lesson for us. What's happening over here? Yehuda is speaking to somebody who he believes to be an Egyptian official, and he wants to be able to convince him to Binyamin, to release Binyamin. You see that Yehuda immediately goes into an assertive tone. Diburim noikfim v'takifim, piercing and strong language. You'd ask the question, how's that a rational approach? This man holds the future of your brother in his hands. Why are you being so belligerent? Maybe speaking gently and softly and respectfully could have been more successful than pushing this harsh agenda. Logic says, first try the soft approach. If that does not work, then you can start shouting and using these expressions. I'm going to start with Paro and end with you. It's not logical to start with harsh expressions, really ziddling the person, making him angry. And then see if that doesn't work, you're going to go back to a softer approach. That really doesn't make sense. Who the explanation is this? If what you're talking about dealing with is somewhat superficial, let's say you're arguing over financial issues. Then you can follow logic. And see which is the best approach to take. But here we're talking about something that goes to the core of your soul. Binyamin and Yaakov are soul bound to each other. This is something that is core to the soul, the being of Yaakov, the soul and being of Binyamin. You're dealing with something so raw and so deep, you don't start working out what's the most diplomatic approach. You go straight to the strongest, most intense way of representing your case. Sounds better in the Yiddish. That's what people say. When something is painful, you scream. You don't start deciding, is it appropriate? When you're dealing with such sensitive issues, to the contrary, when you are shouting and screaming, that in itself illustrates to your counterpart that you're serious, that this is deep, that this cuts you deep in your soul. I'm not worried about money, or a position or honor. That's how you get your words through to the other person. The person starts immediately with power and with a shturim, bangs on the table, doesn't concern himself with what is the appropriate protocols of diplomacy. And then the person on the other end realizes, oh my, this must be something that is extremely important and deep for you. That is effective to get the person to back down. And eventually to even align with what it is that we want from them in the most gracious way. And that is a tremendous lesson, as Rashi implies. Mikan, from here we learn a lesson that applies across time and across situations. Here is Yehuda negotiating on behalf of a Jewish child who is captured by Egypt. When we have something similar in our lives, even if the power that's holding that child comes right from the top, from the greatest authority, it's not a time to call a convention of all the big experts to sit down and very calmly and in a sophisticated way analyze all of the history of Jews in Egypt. And then to vote and to decide how to act. How we should behave, how much we should invest in saving this child. And of course to take into consideration what kind of response we'll get from the Egyptians. For that we're going to need another meeting of another group of experts who understand the psychology of Mitzrayim. We need people who socialize with the Egyptians and understand their culture and their way of thinking. That's not the correct approach. The correct approach is to jump right in with as much power and enthusiasm as possible. To do everything to yank a Jewish child out of a non-Jewish environment and education system. An education which is contrary to the Torah and directly leads to assimilation and intermarriage, which literally threatens people's lives and spiritual lives especially. When we follow that path that was already trod out for us by Yehuda, then we can expect similar results to what Yehuda got from approaching Yosef. By virtue of the fact that Yehuda approached this with such a shturim, not only did Binyamin not remain a slave in Mitzrayim, Paro came to the party and said, welcome aboard, I'm going to give you the best place in Mitzrayim to live. And even before that happened, Yaakov Avinu sends this same person, Yehuda, that before the Jews get down to Mitzrayim, he should establish a kosher educational system. An educational system that illustrates clearly to students how a descendant, a child of Yaakov is supposed to conduct themselves. People who are then empowered to be able to instruct others appropriately according to the rules of Torah. Not only is that relevant in the way that we deal with those forces that capture Jewish souls and suck them into all kinds of unhealthy places, but the same applies even when we approach the Eibishter for input. Yosef is the great tzaddik sitting on the throne of Mitzrayim, representing this flow of hashpah from the Eibishter into the world. When a person, a Jewish person, has the strength to daven to the Eibishter with assertiveness, so to speak, that affects that Yosef can't contain himself anymore, which is exactly what happens in the parasha, and he's got to let go. When a person is sincere and assertive and pushing for the Eibishter's brachas, that opens the channel that those brachas have to happen for everything that we need. From the Eibishter's overflowing, open, holy hand, that we should have everything that we need in absolute abundance. And Mitzvah Hashem, more than anything we need, Mashiach now.